So hi, this is Randy Robin, and I'm here with Dr. Trevan Hatch, and this is Come Follow Me Live. And today we're going to be discussing the topics of Saul, David, and Solomon, especially David's legacy. And let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Hatch and his background so that you'll understand that you've got somebody that's really qualified to speak to these topics. And I hope you'll pay attention and take notes. Also, remember that at the end, on your right-hand side, there's a place for you to write down questions. We'll hold questions until the end. So if you'll put down any questions you have, we'll field those at the very end of the presentation. So as far as the bio goes, Dr. Trevan Hatch is the Anthropology, Bible, and Ancient Near East, Middle East, and Religious Studies Specialist at the Harold B. Lee Library at Brigham Young University. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Ancient Scripture. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at BYU, a Master of Arts in Jewish Studies, Bible and Early Judaism emphasis at Baltimore Hebrew University and Towson University, and a Master of Library and Information Science at the University of Kentucky, a PhD in Interdisciplinary Social Sciences at LSU, Go Tigers, I think, with an emphasis in religion and Judaism, and is currently finishing a PhD in Jewish Studies with an emphasis in Bible and Early Judaism in the Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies in Chicago. And I think that was almost one sentence where I said it like that, but that's very impressive, so good on you. And I will turn the rest of the time over, short of the question and answers, to Dr. Hatch.
Okay, thank you. Let me just pull this slide up here. This is I always found that people follow a little bit better when they see, I'm throwing out a lot of references and names, and this will help you follow. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. This is a really great opportunity to talk about the Hebrew Scriptures and the legacy of David, which continue today. There are a lot of Jewish and Christian groups that are awaiting the Davidic king. And as part of my research right now, my current research on looking at different Jewish and Christian groups that are highly messianic, and they're active today, and I'm looking at what that looks like. So this is really fascinating to me. It bridges the gap of the ancient and the modern. So let's just dive in. I've got a lot to say. Let me just also preface this by saying that my style is one that a lot of my colleagues, some of them will go through the text. I've seen some different podcasts on this subject. Some people will go through the text and give commentary on some of the major stories. Other people will take one main thing and really go into depth. And there's different approaches. So my approach is what I tend to do in my class at BYU, my classes, and then even when I take tour groups to Israel, I always try to focus on the forest from the trees. Not necessarily dumbing it down. Some people hear that and they think, oh, no, we want the trees, we want the details. But this is a scholarly approach. I'll give you some insight that'll serve as a foundation for your continued study of the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, and then even the New Testament next year. So I really think that a bird's eye view sometimes really helps pull things together, and we'll do some of that. And then occasionally I'll funnel into some specifics. So let's dive in. And I'll talk fast, and I'll give you a lot of really fun information I think you'll really enjoy. So this first screen here, I've got Judges. I could have started with Genesis and talked about, even though we're in Samuel and Kings, I wanted to start with Genesis, but we have time constraints. So I'll start with Judges and give you an example of how the authors of the Hebrew Scriptures, whoever they are, especially the later ones, when they're putting the scrolls, they're organizing the scrolls in relation to each other to have the story. Here's one example of the scribes who are they know David. They're thinking of David, and they're also thinking back to Abraham. So here's an example. You got the entire book of Judges is an account of Israel interacting with their neighbors, mainly the Canaanites and the Philistines. Note that these two groups of people play a prominent role in Samuel. And David contends with these people all the time. He defeats them. And so they show up in Judges. Now, notice here in the very second chapter of Judges, God says, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. So right there in the beginning of Judges, the authors are reminding us of the covenant he made with Abraham, looking all the way back. And then throughout the book, it talks about the dysfunction of Israel in the days before the king, when there was all kinds of chaos. And as you can see here on the screen, there are 4 different times there, and this is later in the book, 4 different occasions when they say that in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. So, and I put here the question, why the emphasis on a king? So right here is an example of a pre-David text, not in terms of history, but in terms of just how the narrative goes, where the authors are saying, okay, we're looking back to Abraham and we're looking forward to David. So here, just as a reminder, here is the book of Genesis. Here is the covenant. The purpose is, if you guys remember, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abraham is shown a great land. His posterity will become a great nation, and God's will curse the nation's enemies. Essentially, this covenant will attempt to bless the entire earth through Abraham's family, and they will rule from Jerusalem. Okay, so that's clear back in Genesis. Okay, so we get to Samuel. We finally get to this book that is, all these other books have prepared us for a king. And we have the first half of the Samuel scroll talks about how David becomes king, as you guys remember from the story. And then the second half of the Samuel scroll, what is 2 Samuel today, is about David's reign. Here is what we find in 2 Samuel 7. It says God covenants with David and a bunch of things. So number 1, his offspring will build him a home, a house, like a temple. David's offspring will be God's son, and an everlasting Davidic throne and kingdom will be established. And this is how God is going to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant through the family of Abraham, and then specifically through David's line. The promised messianic kingdom will be the vehicle which will bless all nations of the earth. So the rest of the Hebrew Bible, all of the prophets, the rest of this year when we're studying the prophets, keep an eye on that. So you got Isaiah and Jeremiah and on, all of them, Ezekiel, they're constantly talking, sometimes in roundabout ways, other times directly, about the king, about the future king and what has to happen, how the Israelites have to live in order for this messianic king to come. And then notice here at the bottom here of the screen, I put in 2 Samuel 22, right at the end of the book, David sings praise to God and hope for a future king. If you remember at the beginning of Samuel, Hannah sings her song, like she prays that God will establish a king. And at the very end of the Samuel scroll, it returns to that theme where David sings praise to God and says, bring the future king. Okay, so that's Samuel. Then we get into Kings. And I'm going to go back. We're going to talk about some other things, but I'm just kind of bouncing across the surface now. And in Kings, this scroll begins and ends with Jerusalem and the temple. So the very first king that comes after David is Solomon, and he builds the temple in Jerusalem. And then the very end, the destruction, the very end of the book, or the scroll of Kings, there is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And the book of Kings, as you read through, what it's trying to explain is the long line of Davidic kings who did not meet the expectation in 2 Samuel 7, king after king after king. And I think I put in here, I did right here. We read 32 times where it says that the king, the reader's reading along and in the story, hoping that this next king will be that Davidic king, that victorious king. And 32 times it says, and these kings were evil in the sight of the Lord. That's the whole purpose of the book, is to show the failure of the Judahite kings, the Davidic kings. And then here's the very end of the book where Jehoiakim this man would have been the Davidic king had they not been taken into exile. But the very last final paragraph, he is let out of prison in Babylon and he's allowed to eat at the royal table. This is a cliffhanger in the book, suggesting that that this could be the king who, could Jehoiakim be that king who's going to bring the Davidic kingdom? And then the book ends, and then you get the prophets. Okay, so now let's talk about, let's go through, I want to show you, again, a bird's eye view through Saul and David and into Solomon's experience. But I'll highlight a few things that I think you guys that will help with the story. The main overview, the main purpose, as I'm showing here, is that the goal of the authors is trying to show the transfer of authority and kingship from the tribe of Benjamin to the tribe of Judah, like from Saul to King David. And it's fascinating to watch how they do this. If you keep this in mind as you read the entire book of Samuel, a lot of things will jump out at you. So let me just mention a few of those. Here's just kind of a snapshot of what happens to Saul and David. They both start out with promise, and they both fall flat. So let me just maybe here in the next 5 or 10 minutes review the story with you and point a few things out. So if you remember, Samuel chooses Saul, and it says that he's very tall, and he's very handsome. It makes a point to say that. And he's also like the prophets. It says in some of those early chapters where people see him, they see him with the prophets, and he's walking with them, and he's prophesying, and a little saying starts to go viral, so to speak. It says, could Saul be among the prophets? And that point is, okay, here's our first king. This is coming out of the gates, and there's a lot of promise. But what happens is there's some clouds on the horizon where he looks like he might be there might be some concerns. And as you can see here, he can't find his donkeys. That's kind of I wanted to remember that, so I put it here in the notes. What is this about? Okay, early on, right after he becomes king, it says that he's running around the territory finding his family's donkeys. And he looks kind of foolish. An untrained reader might not pick up on what's happening here, and they might say, okay, that's kind of a weird story. He's running around wasting time trying to find donkeys that he's lost. But if you remember the David and Solomon stories, where there's a couple instances where, like, for example, David leaves Jerusalem, and he goes up to the Mount of Olives, and he specifically knows exactly where to find his donkeys. He gets them, and he rides off. And this is where Absalom is trying to take over Jerusalem, and Absalom himself jumps on his mule, and he chases David. And there's another time where David finds his donkey, and then we all remember Solomon. When Solomon's time has come to be the king, he goes to the Mount of Olives, he finds his donkeys, he has his coronation, he rides his donkey down the Mount of Olives, down the Kidron Valley to the Gihon Spring in Jerusalem, Jerusalem's water source, where he's crowned king. That's his coronation. And in contrast, Saul can't find his donkeys. He's running on, wasting time. So he looks incompetent. And then there's a couple of stories where he disobeys God. He doesn't take care of the Amalekites like he should have. And Samuel comes to Saul and he says, because you have rejected and not obeyed God of Israel, he has rejected you as king. So you're done. Right about that time is I think we're around chapters 15 and 16. And again, we're looking at this transfer of authority. So I think in chapter 16, what you'll see is that God's spirit leaves Saul, specifically mentions it leaves Saul, and he becomes agitated. He's got evil spirits, it says. And in that same chapter, when Samuel is in Bethlehem choosing David as king, it says the Spirit of God entered David. So it's moving from Benjamin. This is a story about how the tribe of Benjamin fell and lost their king, and the tribe of Judah picked that up with David. And then what happens in the very next chapter is, as you see this picture where I illustrated David fighting Goliath. This is a fascinating story. Traditionally, we've kind of made this, especially for the kids, we've taken that story and put it on an island, and we've kind of made it appeal to basic devotional points. Usually it goes something like this. Goliath is 9 feet tall. David is a young boy. He only could have defeated Goliath with the power of God. And then sometimes, like in our lessons, we'll say, what are our Goliaths today? And then we go around the room and we talk about our Goliaths. It's not necessarily a bad lesson. It's not, but it sometimes misses the point of what the authors are trying to do. And here's what we see. So David goes on this trek. This is a 15-mile trek down the Husha Ridge from Bethlehem down to Jerusalem. It's an 8-hour journey where he's sent with provisions. We know the story. He shows up, and here's this Philistine mocking the Israelites. And this is one place where Saul is shown to look incompetent. Remember, he looked strong and tall and handsome, and he was winning wars, and now he's looking completely incompetent. He's sitting in his tent. He's fearful. All of his soldiers are fearful. And here's David says, who is this guy? I could beat this guy, especially with the God of Israel behind me. And then he finds his way. He starts to annoy his brothers, and he's annoying people. And he finally gets into the presence of Saul and he says, I want to fight this Goliath guy. And Saul, and this is very symbolic, where Saul actually gives him his armor. Like, here's the king of Israel who should have been fighting Goliath. And I'll talk about that in a minute, how we know that. But he gives David his armor for David to fight. So the story is fascinating because it's showing how this transfer of power happens. Saul should have been the one to fight David. And we read it in the text where he's a head taller than any man. So he's the king, he's the leader of the military, and it says he's very tall. These are all important because Goliath is also tall. Both of them are about 6.5 feet tall. Okay, how do we know that? I thought Goliath was like 9 feet tall. In the ancient manuscripts, especially the text that the King James used, and we get that translation, those texts post-date Jesus by about 1,000 years. But if we take the Hebrew translations in the Dead Sea, in the Qumran Bible, the Dead Sea sect, what they wrote, and in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, we take those earlier translations, Goliath is not 6 cubits in a span or 9 feet tall, and rather he's 4 cubits in a span. So he's about 6.5, he's 6'6" to 6'9". And that's probably about a head taller than any man. So it's making this point that Saul should have been the one to do that, but he doesn't. He hands it off to David. Now, David rejects the armor. He says, no, I can't fight with that. But there's another little detail that might be overlooked. He chooses a sling. He has a sling. He's a slinger. He chooses a sling. And what we learn in passing in Judges 20 and 1 Chronicles 12, and it just says in passing that the Benjamites were slingers. Like, that was their choice weapon of war, the Benjamites. So he chooses the very weapon that Saul would have been theoretically good at using. So he goes out there, and then we all know the story. He defeats Goliath. So from right at that point, Saul likes David. He brings him into his house and puts him over the military. But not only that, he has him play his music to soothe his evil spirits, to soothe whatever was going on, his mental health, his anxiety, whatever he has. It's ironic that here's David, who's going to succeed him, who's going to take over, and he's the one by his music that is soothing Saul. And then what happens is David starts to defeat the enemies, and another meme, for example, like it goes viral, another, like, so to speak, is where Saul starts to hear people singing or chanting the phrase, the sentence, Saul kills his thousands, but David kills his tens of thousands. And at that point, he gets furious and he starts to find ways to kill David. And then we know, like, a lot of the chapters, they're back and forth. He's trying to catch David. Saul finally dies, and then David takes over the throne. And again, he starts out with a lot of promise. It actually says that he's handsome. His eyes are beautiful. He's loyal to God. He wins a bunch of battles. And the first thing he does is conquer Jerusalem. But just like Saul, David falls flat. His kingdom falls flat. He has the Bathsheba, or Bathsheba, as we say in English. He sleeps with her, kills Uriah. And then from that point on in 2 Samuel, there's dysfunction everywhere. One of his sons rapes Tamar, and then another one of his sons tries to kill the rapist, Amnon. Then Absalom spends a decade trying to plan a conspiracy against David. He moves to the Golan for a few years with his wife's family. And then when he comes back to Jerusalem, David puts him under house arrest for a few years. And then when that's over, Absalom spends like 4 years at the city gate. He's a politician. He spends many years at the city gate. When people come by, he says, hey, David's not gonna take care of you. Whenever you have a problem, come to me. I'll help you. And he starts this groundswell behind him. And then he has a full-on conspiracy. He's got some of David's men in his corner. David flees Jerusalem, and Absalom's chasing him all over the territory. So then that's pretty much the end of Samuel. Then we get into Kings, and again, David starts to look very incompetent towards the end. He's not out fighting with the soldiers. He can't even get warm. He's like, even the warmth of a woman, the Shunammite comes in, he can't get warm, and it's really showing him that he's on a downward swing, in his power. So then we get to Solomon, and here's just an overview. Chapters 1 through 8, he succeeds David and then builds the temple. So again, right out of the gates, starting strong, he builds the temple. And then as an aside, I'll return to this in a minute, but as an aside, The temple is representative of the Garden of Eden. There's angels, there's fruit trees, and that's a point that I'll come back to that's very important for Jerusalem. And then here's a little list I'll give you in chapters 9 through 11 where we get Solomon's downfall. So you have Saul, David, and Solomon repeating the same cycle of failed king, failed king, failed king in some ways. So as you can see this list, he marries hundreds of non-Israelite women. He adopts their gods and introduces their worship. He kills his brother Adonijah, institutes slave labor, amasses great wealth. All of this is in Deuteronomy 17, where it specifically lays out the expectations for the king. And in there, it talks about how you should not amass great wealth, especially not on the backs of your people or the poor. Do not take foreign women. And he does all of that. You can read in those verses. Overspends, overtaxes, and he looks more like a pharaoh than he does David. The result of these three failed kings and Solomon is that the nation splits. And what happens is you get, in today's politics, if you get 3/4 of the country saying things aren't going well, then you're probably going to lose the next election. Here in the ancient world, there's a war and the nation, there's conflict and then the nation splits. So he loses over 80% of the nation. So you get the split of Israel and Judah. Okay, so what time we got? Okay. I want to then come to this. This is something that I think this will be new to you, most likely, but it helps me, like when I teach my students this, it helps us to put different books in the entire conversation of what these authors are thinking about as they're writing or at least redacting these texts in their final form. So Genesis, I chose Genesis because that is the foundational text for the Hebrew scriptures. Absolutely foundational. Everything is there. It goes from creation to the father Abraham, the covenant, the fathers leading into Moses. So Gary Rendsburg, he's a Jewish scholar at Rutgers. I'm friends with him. In fact, I just emailed him last week about an issue we published together. He loves the Bible and he's very conservative in his Bible scholarship. Here's what he writes about the setting of Genesis. He's making the case that the writers who are putting this book in its final form, they're pulling in the traditions and they're putting in the different stories, or at least writing it and redacting this text. This is after the Davidic and Solomonic monarchy. This is after that time where all of those politics and all those geopolitics and all of that is in their mind, and they're responding. They're most likely responding to the northern tribes who left. They're making the argument that you guys left, you shouldn't have left. Jerusalem is the place that this should be, that our worship should be done, not up until Dan where you build a temple, not up in those areas, not at Shechem. It's Jerusalem. And not only that, David and Solomon were legitimate kings. And so here's what he writes. Here's a big paragraph. You guys can follow along, but here's how he describes it. He says, scribes wrote a national epic incorporating all of the earlier traditions back to Abraham and embedded into that narrative anticipations of the present. That is to say, there is a social, religious, and indeed political message in the book of Genesis. Less so in the other 4 books of the Torah, though even there occasionally points shine through. And then he says, or in other words, these scribes tell the story about the past, but reflect upon the present. This was a major accomplishment of the anonymous authors in Jerusalem who created the book of Genesis. I would say redacted. I don't know if they created out of whole cloth. This technique is well known. Take an example from film. The movie MASH, written in 1969, tells the story of American troops during the Korean War. But as all who see that film know, in essence, it is about another land war in Asia, the one still raging in 1969, the one in Vietnam. The anti-war, pro-peace stance of the lead character, Benjamin Franklin Hawkeye Pierce, reflects the present, which is the late 1960s, but is anachronistic for the early 1950s. So he's basically saying that, that movie that is set during the Vietnam War was really about the Korean War, but they're speaking about current issues, even though they're supposedly talking about a prior time. And this is what the book of Genesis is. So let's give you some examples that, and David, this is David's legacy. This is David and Solomon and how that golden age is weighing upon these authors and how they're trying to put them into the most important of texts, which is Genesis. So not any one of these points is necessarily a strong point, but if you see them together, you can start to think, man, this might be a good argument from Gary Rensburg. So God, and one of them, God promised Abraham and Sarah that kings will stem from them, will come from them. Then we read in Genesis 15, the boundaries of the land of Canaan promised to Abraham in Genesis match the very boundaries in the heyday of Israel's Davidic Solomonic monarchy. You also have Judah. He's emphasized in the book of Genesis. He plays a prominent role. He receives a blessing that his tribe will produce kings. And the tribe of Judah was the dominant tribe in the southern kingdom. Okay, then we have Genesis. In Genesis, we have an emphasis placed on Jerusalem. And this is fascinating because here, for example, in Genesis 2, mentions the Gihon as one of the rivers of Eden, Gihon River. But notice that the Gihon Spring was Jerusalem's water source after David conquered the city. They called this the Gihon Spring. And if you remember, there's prophecies that water will flow from Jerusalem, from the temple, and will flow down to the Dead Sea, and it will return Jerusalem to its Edenic paradise. It'll be like Eden. So if you remember, when Solomon built the temple, it took on Garden of Eden symbolism, and imagery. So we read this in Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Joel. Also, you have Abraham traveling to Jerusalem. He paid tithes to Melchizedek, and then he sacrifices a ram on Mount Moriah, or the Mount of Yahweh. This is where the temple would later sit. So what I do is Gary puts these three together. He says these three elements, the priesthood, sacrifice to Yahweh, and the Gihon Spring, legitimize Jerusalem as the current administrative and sacrificial capital of the Davidic Solomonic kingdoms. And so I just wanted to put this last sentence here to remind us that this might have been a response to the northern tribes who've broken away. They said, don't you remember Abraham? He came here. This is where Eden was, or, the center of the earth, according to the authors. Okay, also in Genesis, you have brother issues. You have where the younger brother is favored. And here's a list. You got Cain over Abel, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Judah over his older brothers from Leah. You have Joseph over his older brothers, Ephraim over Manasseh, and then Moses over Aaron. Although that last one is just right after Genesis, is continuing that in that vein. So again, this might provide legitimacy to David and Solomon as kings, because David was the youngest son, yet he became king, youngest son of Jesse. And then Adonijah was David's oldest son. After Absalom died, he should have been king, but yet it was Solomon who becomes king. So as the writers are retelling their traditions about Jacob and Joseph and Ephraim, people might be thinking about the way they write it, the way they talk about it, or even just at the time and place when people are thinking about how we can convince the northern tribes that David and Solomon were legitimate kings, these stories would have spoken to them. You also have a lot of stories of fraternal strife and even fratricide, brothers trying to kill brothers. So you have Isaac and Ishmael are fighting, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, and then one of the brothers who killed the other one is Cain kills Abel. And there's another point here that's crucial. So David's son, Absalom, kills his brother Amnon, and Solomon kills his brother Adonijah. Notice that there's some wording here that's exactly the same. Cain kills Abel, quote, in the field, unquote. That's in Genesis 4. Absalom killed Amnon, quote, in the field. So Gary Rensburg thinks this is not a coincidence. These are the writers have these stories of David and his sons in mind as they're retelling and constructing their national history. Okay, here's another one that's important, Judah and Tamar. This is a very strange story. It seems to be random. It's stuck right in the middle of the Joseph section in Genesis 38. So what this is probably doing is setting up Judah as a David. These two mirror each other. So both are shepherds who separate from their brothers, and both of them move to a city called Adullam. Judah's wife is the name of his wife is Bathshua. It means the daughter of Sheva, or daughter of Shua. David's wife is Bathsheba, the daughter of Sheva. Notice, though, in Chronicles, where the author senses, he knows, he or she, whoever's writing it, knows that this is happening. and knows that Judah and David are being written in relation to each other. And so he changes David's wife to Bathsheba. They're both called Bathsheba. Not only that, they both have daughters named Tamar, Judah and David. Tamar is Judah's daughter-in-law, and then David has a daughter, Tamar, both of whom are at the center of sexual scandal. David is also the Judahite king, and as I say here, the story in Genesis 38 might have been constructed or retold with David in mind. All that scandal, all those problems. Okay, and then we've got a few other examples. I won't spend too much more time, but also you have patriarchs passing some of their wives off as sisters. They're saying, she's my sister. This happens to Abraham and Isaac, both of those. But you also have David and Abigail were siblings, step sibling, and so was Amnon and Tamar. So again, the readers, this is probably an apologetic to defend David and Solomon and their kingdoms, and then all that chaos, all those things that happened. I already mentioned that. And then finally, there's 3 place names in Genesis are related to David. So you have Judah goes to Adullam, Rachel is associated with Bethlehem, and Jacob goes to Mahanaim. David was born in Bethlehem, relocates to Adullam, and seeks refuge in Mahanaim. Okay, so that right there is an example. I wanted to flesh all that out for you to show that here is David's legacy is not just in Samuel and then mentioned a few times in the rest of the history with the Davidic king. Like David is saturated, like all through the text from Genesis, early on, all through the prophets. They're thinking back and they're looking at David as a king, and even the chronicler, the people who write chronicles. If you notice what they do to the David story, they take out all the bad stuff. They put in as they're going through the David chapters, they remove Bathsheba, they remove Uriah, they remove some of that, and it's just all the good stuff. And I think what they're trying to show is that if David if he didn't have some of those human flaws, he would be like the Davidic king. When the Davidic king comes, he will reign like David's best parts, David's best times. So the chronicler is also wrestling with David's legacy. The Psalms are replete with David all over the place, and then the Gospels. So that's where we come to now, legacy of David. So it's time I got a few minutes. I'll show you a few examples. If we don't get to all of them, that's fine. But here's some, we're talking, 900 years or even 500 or 600 years after the texts were written in their final form, 400 or 500 years. And so that's a long period of time where David remains central. So here's some examples of Jesus, how the authors of Gospels write about Jesus. So they're both associated with Bethlehem. They're both start their ministry, so to speak, at age 30. They're both called shepherds of their father's flocks in so many ways. Jesus is referred to as God's son, and then David is God's begotten son in Psalm 2. Jesus is called beloved son, and I note here that one of the meanings of the Hebrew root of David, dalet, vav, dalet, is beloved. So Jesus is actually called not just beloved son, but he's called Davidic son, as another translation, another way to kind of say it, a Davidic son. And then, I can't cover all of them, but it's all the way throughout the Gospels. And I've skipped over Jesus's genealogy. That has David all over the place, both conspicuous and inconspicuous. It's all over the place. But then when you get to the second story of the Magi, the wise men, you have Solomon, David and Solomon's legacy, Solomon as a son of David. So here's how this works. You've got these wise men who come as Gentile royalty or whoever they are, coming from another land, bringing gifts and proclaiming and honoring Israel's king. In Isaiah 60, in the early part of Isaiah 60, it tells us that representatives will come from the kingdom of Sheva, or as we say in English, Sheba, and bring gold and frankincense and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. In 1 Kings 10:10, the queen of Sheba brings spices and gold to King Solomon, a son of David. Psalm 72 anticipates that the kings of Sheba will bring gifts and fall down before Solomon with their gold. Psalm 45, this is written to a victorious king whose robes are all fragrant with myrrh. So you can imagine, here's Matthew trying to tell the story of who he thinks is the Davidic king. He's trying to go throughout the Roman Empire and make the case that Jesus or Joshua is Israel's king, the Davidic king. And so he's pulling in, or at least he's he's writing it so that people will say, this is Solomon, this is in Isaiah, and this is Psalms, this is in Kings. So this is another way that David shows up. Let me show you. Okay, to show you another one. When he's crowned king, like right after that, the very first thing he does is he goes into Jerusalem and he contends with the Jebusite leaders in Jerusalem. It says David and his men enter Jerusalem just after the coronation. And what he does is what they say is that you guys are so weak that even if you break in, even our blind and our lame will turn you back. It's kind of a strange story that even there's a lot of scholars who are trying to wrestle with exactly what this means. And David responds, when I break into there, I will turn the blind and the lame loose. I will turn them away, and they will not be allowed to come back into this house or into this spot, into the temple spot that would later be. I mean, this is the high place. Even the Jebusites up on the top of the hill, this is the sanctuary. And in this whole area, the blind and the lame will be turned out. This is probably written with Leviticus in mind, or vice versa. Leviticus could have been written, the law, with David in mind, or vice versa, whichever text was written before the other. Leviticus says that for no one who has blemish shall draw near, one who is blind or lame shall not come near the curtain or approach the altar, that he may not profane my sanctuaries. And then what we read is in Jeremiah 31, the later prophet, he says at a future time, in the Messianic age, the blind and the lame will be welcomed back to Zion, to the Lord our God. In other words, this is the temple. This is fascinating. This helps us understand this strange, the way that the account is in the Gospels, where immediately after Jesus' coronation, it's kind of like a coronation where he gets on a donkey, he rides down the Mount of Olives, just like Solomon. The first thing he does when he comes into Jerusalem is he contends with the priests in Jerusalem. And then what it says here in Matthew 21 is that the blind and the lame came into the temple complex. They weren't already there. It says they came in, if you remember those prophecies of Jeremiah and others. Jesus then heals them, and then it says that little children. So we're in the midst of a riot, a mini temple riot, and there's blind and the lame, and then there's children there. And they exclaim, Hosanna to the Son of David. It seems odd that there would be children. And, once a riot starts in the temple, we know this from Josephus. Once something like this starts to happen, it always ends in blood. And there's always, it's a big, many thousands of people die. There's 2 or 3 different instances in Josephus where it says that thousands died when they revolted and protested the temple. So it's odd that you have the blind and lame and children there. But this is written with those trying to argue, trying to show that Jesus illustrates that he is the Son of David. And so the author of Matthew quotes Psalm 8, which is specifically mentioned as a Psalm of David in the first verse. And it says, out of the mouth of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. Okay, we probably run out of time, but let me just show you one very short one. This will just take 1 minute. And that is even in his arrest in Gethsemane, when he shows up, and these are passages that we don't associate with David. We just kind of read them. But if you remember, when the police arrive and they ask, are you Jesus? And he says, I am he. This is kind of echoing back to Moses, where God says, I am. Jesus says, I am he. And then it says the soldiers stopped, they stepped back and fell to the ground. In Psalm 27, it states that when David's adversaries and foes attack him, they will stumble and fall before his face. And Psalm 35 explains that the Lord will cause David's enemies to be turned back and confounded when they contend with him. So again, the authors of the Gospels, the legacy of David is very, very strong, especially at the time of Jesus, when messianic expectations reached a fever pitch. People were expecting a Davidic king. And so even in the late first century, when the authors of the Gospels, when they're writing this, they have their Hebrew Bible open, so to speak, and they are really trying to craft it so that it's unmistakable. People think of David when they're reading about Jesus. So I'll stop there. I've got some other slides, and I think that you guys can ask whatever questions. Okay, is that good? Should I stop sharing? Okay, does that work?
Randy, yeah. We need you to get your mic on. Well, Trevan, I was excited to hear.
Different places to turn it on and off. and I picked the first four first. So that was enjoyable. Thank you. These are just my questions, but I'll ask them anyway. Why is David so revered as a king, especially by the Jews, when he's so clearly flawed with committing adultery and murder? And we know, at least as Latter-day Saints, and I would think that the Jews know too, the severity of particularly murder. So how does one separate David as a Messiah figure and as a Christ figure with his inappropriate actions, and why is it that it seems like to kind of shield off the negative portion, if you will?
It's a good question. It's difficult to answer, but what comes to mind is that with the Abrahamic covenant, if you remember, you go way back to Genesis, the authors seem to try to make a point that you have a failure on the part of Adam and Eve, and then there's a downward spiral of humanity. God starts again. You have Noah. And then there's he makes mistakes. Then there's a downward spiral of humanity. And then when he gives Abraham the covenant, he says, through your family, I'll bless bless the entire world. And then what we get is one flawed person after another. And it's almost like the authors are trying to make a point. These are very flawed people. And even then, God's not going to, he's going to keep his covenant. So then it goes all the way through, and David still, they put, Judah even way back, and then David, Solomon. These are people who are flawed, and therefore it's why they themselves didn't establish, God didn't establish a line with them, an everlasting kingdom. It's still to come. And the reason why that happens is because they're flawed. But we revere them as kings because they're important. That's my guess. That's kind of my reading, is that we're imperfect, and God's going to keep his covenant with us.
So even like with Rahab the harlot, and you have that lineage going on to Christ, you have blemishes in that posterity, but that's kind of all part of the fall and part of all that's absorbed in the greatness and the atonement of Jesus Christ.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
I could say.
Yeah.
Brother Hatch, you've hit the bar way high today, and the amount of preparation and your willingness to be on our Come Follow Me Live today, and your presentation had to have taken the entire week to put it together. So I really appreciate. What kind of things are you doing, Dr. Hatch, and that you would like this audience to know? What is it that?
Yeah. So you mean like some of my research and what I'm involved
some of the
with heavily?
research where they could find more about you, what you're currently doing. Are you doing any tours? Are you doing any big presentations that we should just be aware of right now?
Yeah. So thanks for asking and allowing me to talk about that. So some of my recent projects, I published a book with a national, like a Christian religious studies press on Jesus. And so it's called A Stranger in Jerusalem, Seeing Jesus as a Jew. And I think the reason why they accepted that book, and I most of the scholars, at least in the previous generation who are Latter-day Saint, would just default to a Latter-day Saint press, because, we could speak to our people, and it's easier to get published and to write about what you want to write about to our people. But I thought I'll try this national press, and what I said is, we have all kinds of people writing about the Jesus traditions and the historical Jesus. You got Muslims, even with Reza Aslan. You have Jewish and Christian and secular scholars. The Latter-day Saint scholars haven't necessarily put a book out like this that allows people to see how a Latter-day Saint deals with Jesus studies, the Jesus traditions, the historical Jesus. So that was a fun book to write. I published that a few years ago, and that goes into depth about the Messianic age and what behind the scenes, what's happening. I'm pulling from Josephus and all the texts and trying to show how the Jesus traditions within their Jewish context, how would you in the 2nd or 3rd century hearing or reading any of these traditions, what they would think. And so that was a fun book. And then I recently published one last year. It was an edited volume with the Jewish Studies chair at Creighton University, Leonard Greenspoon. We published a book with Latter-day Saints and Jewish scholars, sort of a dialogue book. And then my current projects, I've got a book on Holy Week with Eric Huntsman. He's the director of the Jerusalem Center right now. We just went to press with Deseret Book and the Religious Studies Center at BYU on a Latter-day Saint guide to celebrating Easter season or Holy Week. And that'll be out in February. And so we really wanted to help Latter-day Saints see how Christians have celebrated traditionally the various days of Holy Week, give some scholarship on each day of the week and what happened to Jesus, and give some suggestions for Latter-day Saints on how they might start to develop some traditions for their family. And, so I'm doing some of that. I also lead tours with Sacred Space Tours. I've got 3 tours posted for 2023 if anyone's interested. I've got a YouTube channel, Strangers in Jerusalem YouTube channel. So I'm doing lots of different things.
Well, I follow you on Facebook and through Holy Week with you and Eric Huntsman, and I was inspired by many of your posts and how you corralled your family and some of the activities that you did. And I know Brother Huntsman is the same way, in 2 minds like you, co-authoring in a book called Holy Week. All of these links, by the way, to your tour on Sacred Spaces with your book Stranger in Jerusalem, not to mention your YouTube channel and your podcast that I download on Amazon, or not Amazon, I download on Apple, and I can download on Stitcher, all those fine places. You're not a hard person to find. You're all over. How do you have time to? And then you have a young family, a really young family. Do you want to say anything else that I missed out, or anything? Because we're going to list all those links in our description here, so no one's going to miss anything. Okay.
Yeah, it's fun. I find, I don't know how I find time. Really, it's like I try to repurpose different things. Like I even asked you, can I take this recording and drop it in? And so I really do. I funneled some of my master's thesis work on the Pharisees, funneled that into my Jesus book, and so I'm doing a lot of different things. But I was trained well at LSU. My advisor says don't do anything unless you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So that's just how I kind of do it. I just I think ahead and just write a project that can be spun out. In fact, this presentation here that seemed to take a lot of work, it did, but it was over several years. But when writing my book and my lectures, this is what I give my BYU students, and it really helps them think. And we have a lot of good discussions, like when a text is authored, and Genesis, and what is David doing in the Gospels, and how is Matthew using this. It really brings out some good discussion about how we can see Scripture. Like, what is Scripture? Is it iron? Is all Scripture created equal? Is it ironclad directly from God and through the mouth of a prophet via Urim and Thummim, or is there some human elements and fingerprints? We discuss all that, and this is the kind of stuff I talk about to bring that discussion out. Will
you share that PowerPoint presentation with us, or is that proprietary? And if we keep it, I'd love to have it.
Yeah, I can share it.
I'll share
it with you.
Yeah, we'll post that in the links as well. I noticed you're starting your second dissertation after 8 years of this academic study. And when do you think that will? When you get it all the pieces put together, how far away are you for that?
Let me just spend 1 minute, because people don't like an overachiever, right? So I always have to say there was a method to this. I have 2 masters and 2 doctoral degrees, but a lot of it just, the short story is that when the recession happened in 2009, 2010, that area, I wasn't getting into PhD programs with funding, despite having high GPA and GRE. And so I was discouraged. I was in the ancient world. And so what I did is I left to LSU. I got funding there to study in the social sciences, and I wrote my dissertation on American Jews. But during that time, when I wasn't sure I was going to get funding to LSU, during that summer, I thought, if I don't get funding and I can't go there, I still want to finish my graduate training in biblical studies and Jewish studies. So I found this program in Chicago where their target audience is older adult Jews who are already working in the Jewish community at the synagogue, or teaching Holocaust studies at community college, or rabbis. So they do it distance, and then we fly into Chicago a couple times a year, have our in-class seminars, and then we come home and write our papers. And so I just started doing those at the same time, and they're both related to Jewish studies. So I just kind of see them as one doctoral degree, even though they're technically 2, and I'm just having fun with it. So,
well, you have been a marvel, and Okay, well, thank you so much. We're going to say goodbye for now, and we hope we get you back when we start the New Testament, because what you're working on right now is how to read the New Testament and the Old Testament from a Jewish perspective. And I can't wait to get started again on the New Testament in our Come Follow Me. And for now, to our audience, and we want to say goodbye until next time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.